She was 7 years old, and she vanished between the clothesline and the back porch. 12 feet of dust and sunlight, and that 12 feet swallowed her whole. Nobody in Craw Creek believed it at first. Little May Calloway was the kind of child who could be found anywhere, behind the grain barn, down at the creek with her shoes off, or sitting in old Hector's saddle talking to the horse like it was her best friend. She was spirited. She was loud. She was everywhere. And then, one dry Tuesday in August of 1887, she was nowhere at all. Her mother, Ruth Calloway, had turned her back for 5 minutes, just 5, to pull the sheets from the line before the dust storm rolling in from the mesas swallowed the yard. When she turned around, the yard was empty. Not the quiet kind of empty either, the wrong kind. The kind that makes a mother's stomach drop before her mind even catches up to why. Ruth screamed May's name until her voice cracked. She ran through the barn, through the corn rows, down to the creek. She called until the sun started bleeding orange across the horizon and the first cold wind of evening hit her wet cheeks. By the time her husband, Dale Calloway, rode back in from the north pasture, Ruth was sitting in the dirt of the yard, her hands over her mouth, shaking. Dale Calloway was not a man who frightened easily. He'd served in 2 campaigns, buried a brother, and lost an entire season's crop to locusts without shedding a tear. But when he looked at his wife sitting in that dust, something inside him went very, very still. By nightfall, every lantern in Craw Creek was lit. Now, Craw Creek was a town that sat right on the edge of 2 worlds. To the west, the land belonged to Harlan Voss, 3,000 acres of cattle range, scrubland, and water rights that made him the most powerful man in the county. To the east, a dozen smaller ranches scratched and clawed at the same dry earth, and none of them had more than 500 acres to their name. The Calloways were East Side people. Dale ran 200 head of cattle and a modest horse breeding operation, and he did it without borrowing money from Harlan Voss, which made him unusual and which, depending on who you asked, made him either admirable or stubborn to the point of stupidity. The tension between the Voss operation and the East Side ranchers had been simmering for years. Water. Always water. There was a river that cut through the county, the Sulphur, and Harlan Voss's legal team had spent the better part of a decade tying up its rights and paperwork. The East Side ranchers were watching their wells drop inch by inch every dry season. Meetings had been held. Letters had been written. Twice, fences had been cut in the night. And twice, nobody could prove who'd done it. It was into this tension that May Calloway disappeared. The search party found nothing that first night. No tracks that held their shape in the windswept dust. No scrap of her yellow dress caught on a fence post. Nothing. By morning, Sheriff Tomas Reel had ridden in from the county seat. A lean, careful man with more patience than most people gave him credit for and a reputation for not jumping to conclusions. He walked the yard. He walked the road. He crouched at the edge of the Calloway property where it met the dirt trail that connected the East Side ranches to the main road, and he stared at the ground for a very long time. Then he stood up and said, quietly, to his deputy, "Well, tracks. Wagon. Headed west. West. Toward Voss land." He said nothing about this to Dale Calloway. Not yet. He was a careful man, Tomas Reel. But Dale Calloway was watching from the porch, and Dale Calloway had spent 20 years reading land and sky and the faces of men who weren't telling him everything. He saw the direction the sheriff was looking. He saw the tightness around Tomas's eyes. He went inside, loaded his rifle, and saddled his horse. Ruth caught him at the gate. She grabbed the bridle with both hands. A small woman, barely 5'2", but she held that horse like she was made of iron. "Dale," she said. "Dale, you listen to me. You go riding onto Voss land with that rifle, and you don't come back. Neither of us comes back from that." Her voice wasn't shaking. That was what stopped him. Ruth always shook when she was frightened. This time, she was absolutely still. "Let Tomas do his job," she said. "Please." He looked at her for a long time. Then he dismounted, but he kept the rifle. Sheriff Tomas Reel rode to the Voss ranch that afternoon alone. The Voss spread was an operation unto itself. A main house that looked more like a hotel than a home, 3 bunkhouses, a cook shack, a smithy, 2 hay barns, and somewhere between 40 and 60 hired hand, depending on the season. Harlan Voss met him on the front porch. He was a big man, 60-ish, with a gray mustache and the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who could make it stick. "Sheriff," Harlan said, extending his hand. "What brings you all the way out here?" Tomas shook the hand. "Dale Calloway's little girl went missing yesterday. 7 years old. Well, tracks lead in this direction. Just checking every possibility." Harlan's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes, quick as a fish in deep water. "That's terrible news," he said. "We haven't seen any child out this way. But you're welcome to ask my men." Tomas asked. He spent 2 hours on that ranch, walking through the bunkhouses, the barns, the cook shack. The hands were cooperative, easy-mannered, saying all the right things. Nobody had seen a little girl. Nobody had been off the property yesterday. But one man, a quiet, hawk-faced hand named Cutter Briggs, wouldn't look Tomas in the eye. Not once. He answered every question with his gaze fixed somewhere over Tomas's left shoulder. Men lied in all kinds of ways, and Tomas had seen enough of them to know that some liars got loud, and some liars went very, very quiet. Cutter Briggs was the quiet kind. Tomas filed this away and rode back to town. That evening, the situation changed. A note appeared at the Calloway ranch, tucked under a stone on the porch step. No stamp, no signature. Ruth found it when she went out to check the yard one last time before dark. For words, penciled in a rough hand. Deed. River rights. May. Ruth stood on that porch step in the cooling dark for a full minute before she went inside and showed Dale. Dale read it 3 times. His jaw went tight as a bolted gate. The message was plain enough, even in its ugliness. Hand over the water deed to the Sulphur River, the one piece of paper that gave the East Side ranchers any legal foothold against Voss's encroachment, and May comes home. The Calloways didn't own that deed alone. It had been signed by 6 East Side ranching families, a collective claim filed by a lawyer in Abilene 3 years ago. It was the East Side's last card, and someone was using a 7-year-old girl to take it off the table. Dale went to Tomas' reel that night. He rode hard, arrived at Tomas's office at 9:10, and laid the note on the desk without a word. Tomas read it. He set it down. He looked at Dale for a long moment. "You tell the other families yet?" "No." "Good." Tomas folded the note carefully. "Don't. Not yet." "Why?" "Because if word gets out and this county goes up," Tomas said slowly, "May Calloway is the one who pays for it." Dale looked like he wanted to break every piece of furniture in the room. But he nodded. He rode home. He said nothing to the other ranchers. Ruth, however, Ruth had already done something that neither Tomas nor Dale knew about. After finding the note, and before Dale had come back in from the barn, she had walked quietly to her writing desk and composed a letter. She addressed it to the Abilene newspaper, the Daily Plains Courier, and she gave it to her neighbor's boy to carry to the postal stage that night. She was not a woman who waited for men to solve things. The next 48 hours were the longest of Dale Calloway's life. He worked the ranch in a kind of mechanical silence, doing the tasks his hands remembered without his mind being involved, while Ruth moved through the house like a ghost, cooking, cleaning, folding laundry that didn't need folding. They barely spoke. At night, Dale sat on the porch with the rifle across his knees and watched the dark. On the 3rd morning, a rider came from the east. Not from Vossland, from the direction of old Ezra Thorne's place, the furthest east side ranch, half a day's ride toward the county line. The rider was Ezra's eldest son, 22-year-old Caleb Thorne, and he was riding fast, and he looked pale. He pulled up at the Calloway gate and said, breathing hard, "Someone's been in our south barn. Someone's been living there. We found food wrappers, a blanket, a boot print in the mud, small, child-sized." Ruth was off the porch before Caleb finished speaking. They rode to the Thorne place in a group, Dale, Ruth, Caleb, and 2 of the Thorne hands. Sheriff Tomas was sent for, but hadn't arrived yet. The south barn was a half-collapsed structure set back in a stand of mesquite, barely used anymore, far enough from the main house that no one would have thought to check it in those first frantic days of searching. The blanket was cheap wool, the kind sold at the trading post in town. The food wrappers were from hardtack and dried beef. Impressed into the soft mud near the door, small, clear, unmistakable, was the outline of a child's shoe. May's size. Ruth crouched over that print for a long time. When she stood, her eyes were dry, but her hands were trembling. She was here, she said. She was here, and she's not anymore. They searched the surrounding mesquite for 2 hours. Nothing. Whoever had been holding May had moved her, probably the night before, probably when it became clear the Calloways weren't immediately breaking. They'd moved her deeper, or further. Tomas arrived and assessed the scene carefully. He sent for a tracker, a Comanche man named Harley Sixkiller, who worked out of a trading post 2 counties over and who had a reputation that made other trackers uncomfortable. Harley arrived by evening. He spent 40 minutes in the failing light walking circles around the barn, crouching, standing, crouching again. Then he walked a widening spiral into the scrubland. When he came back, he said, 2 men, 1 horse, 1 mule. They headed northwest. 3 hours ahead of us, maybe 4. Northwest, still toward Vossland. Dale Calloway looked at Tomas Reel. Tomas looked at Dale. I need you to trust me a little longer, Tomas said. My daughter, Dale said, very quietly, has been gone 3 days. I know. Tomas held his gaze. Give me until morning. Dale turned without answering and went to his horse. Ruth put her hand on Tomas's arm as she passed him. Until morning, she said. It was not quite a promise. What happened that night has been pieced together from several accounts, none of them complete, some of them contradictory in their details. What's agreed upon is this. Tomas Reel did not sleep. He rode back to the Voss ranch alone, in the dark, arriving sometime after midnight. He did not knock on the front door. He went instead to the bunkhouse where Cutter Briggs slept, and he woke Cutter Briggs up, and he sat across from him on a hay bale in the dark with no lantern lit. And he said something, no one knows exactly what. That made Cutter Briggs put his face in his hands and not come back up for a very long time. At 4 a.m, Tomas rode northwest. He had directions. He found May Calloway in an abandoned line shack near the base of the mesa, for miles inside what everyone in the county understood to be Voss territory, even if no fence marked it cleanly. She was sitting on the floor with her knees pulled up to her chest, wrapped in the same blanket from the thorn barn, and she was alive. Unharmed, scared in the bone-deep, quiet way that children get when they've been frightened for too long and have used up all their tears. She looked at Tomas when he came through the door and said, I knew somebody would come. There were 2 men with her. They didn't fight. Cutter Briggs, it turned out, had sent word ahead, some signal or absence of signal that Tomas had arranged, and whatever the arrangement was, it held. The 2 men laid down their weapons and sat in the dirt, and waited for the deputies who arrived an hour behind Tomas. Tomas wrapped May in his own coat and put her on his horse in front of him and rode back toward the Calloway ranch as the sky turned from black to gray to the first pale orange of dawn. Ruth saw them coming from half a mile away. She was already on the porch. She'd never gone to sleep. And she walked out through the gate and down the road toward them, slowly at first, then faster, then running, her skirts lifted in both hands, running through the dust and the cold morning air until she reached them and took her daughter from Tomas's arms and sank to her knees in the road, holding May against her chest, not saying a single word. Dale arrived on the road a moment later. He stopped his horse. He looked at Ruth and May in the dust. He looked at Tomas. He swung down from the saddle, walked forward, and went to his knees beside his wife and daughter, and the 3 of them stayed that way in the middle of the road while the sun came up around them. Tomas Reel sat on his horse and looked at the horizon and gave them their moment. Then came the part nobody wanted. The 2 men arrested at the line shack were ranch hands, hired men, nobody from the county, brought in specifically for this job. They talked. In that era, with what was coming down on them, they talked fast. And what they said pointed directly at Harlan Voss. Not a smoking gun, not a signed order, but close. Close enough. Harlan Voss denied everything. He was a man with lawyers, and those lawyers arrived in Craw Creek within a week, and they were sharp and expensive and very good at what they did. The hired men's testimony was imperfect. There were gaps. Harlan had never appeared in person, never written anything down. He claimed the men had acted alone, rogue elements who'd cooked up a scheme he knew nothing about. It was, as Tomas said later, the kind of story you can't disprove without a confession. No confession came, but something else happened. Ruth Calloway's letter to the Daily Plains Courier had been received and held for 3 days while the editor, a meticulous man named Edgar Plum, verified what he could. When May was found, he published it. The full story. The water rights. The note. The deed. The disappearance. The West Side land grab that had been slowly strangling the East Side ranchers for a decade. The story was picked up by 3 other papers in a week. Within a month, a state land commissioner arrived in Craw Creek unannounced. He spent 10 days reviewing the water rights filings, the legal maneuvers, the paperwork that Harlan Voss's team had been quietly building for years. What he found, or what he chose to publicize, was a pattern of manipulation that went far beyond one county's water dispute. Harlan Voss never went to prison for May Calloway's kidnapping. The legal case collapsed under the weight of its own gaps and the expense of his defense. He was a powerful man, and powerful men in 1887 rarely went to prison for things they were careful enough not to sign their names to. But his grip on the county broke. The water rights were renegotiated under state supervision. The East Side ranchers kept their deed. The Sulphur River ran for every ranch that needed it. The Voss operation, without the leverage of water, contracted, sold off, reduced itself to something that could still be called a ranch, but couldn't be called an empire anymore. Harlan Voss died 7 years later in a hotel room in San Antonio. Alone, diminished, a man who had made himself small through the grand ambition of trying to make himself everything. Cutter Briggs served 2 years in the county jail. When he got out, he left Texas entirely. Some said he went to New Mexico. Some said further. He never came back to Craw Creek, and nobody there spent much time wondering about him. The 2 hired men served longer. They had no expensive lawyers. May Calloway grew up on the East Side ranch she'd been born on. She grew up near the Sulphur River, which ran free and clean every spring. She grew up knowing, the way children know things they were too young to understand at the time, that her mother had done something extraordinary. Not the running through the dust, not the holding in the road, though those things were true and real, but the letter, the quiet, deliberate, devastating letter that Ruth Calloway had written in the 10 minutes between finding a ransom note and her husband coming back through the door. May went to school in the county seat. She studied law. She became one of the first women admitted to the Texas bar. In 1903, 16 years after the summer she disappeared. She specialized in land rights. She was, by all accounts, very good at it. And in her office, in a plain wooden frame on the wall behind her desk, she kept one thing that she'd brought from her mother's writing desk. A small piece of paper, pressed flat, the ink faded but legible. For words in a rough hand. Not the ransom note. The draft of the letter. Ruth's handwriting, written in the 10 minutes that changed everything. Dear editor, it began. My name is Ruth Calloway, and I need you to hear what's been done to this county.